Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we go traipsing and trolling, winsomely, frolicking through the last week in terms of Vatican and global Catholic Church headlines, and in keeping with the official policy of the Francis papacy that there may never be a quiet week, this was not a quiet week. We actually have 7 different stories to cover. This is sort of like the lightning round of Last Week in the Church. Let's get started. We begin with forgiving but not forgetting. Latest developments in the Vatican girl case suggest that in the wake of a war of words over the legacy of Pope John Paul II, both sides are willing to let bygones be bygones, but they haven't forgotten the tensions that erupted. Second, the trial trundles on. The Vatican's trial of the century involving charges of financial corruption against 10 different people, including for the first time a cardinal, Italian Cardinal Angelo Becciu, held its 55th and 56th hearings this past week, still with no clear indication that any crime is actually committed. We'll examine that. Third, clampdown on the chapel. The Vatican's chief prosecutor has announced that May 24th, a trial against the former junta at the Sistine Chapel is going to begin, again over charges of financial irregularities. We'll explain why this illustrates an interesting principle about crime and punishment in the Pope Francis era. Fourth, busting the Blitz. Another trial, yet another Vatican trial, is going to begin also on May 24th against 2 radical Italian environmental activists for a stunt they pulled in the Vatican museums last year. We'll talk about what that's all about. Fifth, of the blues and the grays, the latest vicissitudes of the Pope's Twitter account, and why this poses the question of who actually has the greater claim to infallibility in the 20th century. Is it the Pontiff or Elon Musk? Sixth, we have angling for Anglicans, how the past week brought both a step forward and a step back in Catholic-Anglican relations. And finally, hungering for Hungary. Pope Francis is set next weekend to make a quick 3-day trip to Hungary. We'll explain what's at stake there. All that and more is waiting for you on the other side of a quick break, so please stick around. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, April 25th, or as we would say here in Italy, Buona Festa della Liberazione, because today is a national holiday in Italy. It's the Feast of Liberation. It commemorates April 25th, 1945, when basically the German occupation of Italy ended, the fascist regime crumbled, and independence was restored. Now, totally by coincidence, my wife Elise and I were recently in Nettuno and Anzio. These are 2 communities about an hour south of Rome, right on the beach. It's where Allied forces arrived in 1943 to begin a very difficult and bloody campaign to liberate Italy. We visited the cemetery for the American war dead. There, it is a hauntingly beautiful spot. All in, about 23,000 Americans gave their lives to liberate this country. And, you know, I'm somebody who has lived my entire adult life in Italy, more or less. I am profoundly conscious that my life has benefited in incalculable ways from the sacrifice that those brave souls made almost 80 years ago. And so to me, today is a reminder that we have to always strive to be worthy of that sacrifice. I mean, to quote the movie Saving Private Ryan, we need to earn this. And today is a reminder that that's a project that we need to work on every day of our lives. All right, on with the news. So we begin this week with the latest twists in the Vatican girl case. So this is the story of a 15-year-old girl named Emanuela Orlandi who disappeared on June 22nd, 1983. She was the daughter of a minor Vatican employee. So her disappearance immediately got swept up into broader narratives about the Vatican. Over the last 40 years, it has become basically the Kennedy assassination of Italy. That is, the kind of defining national trauma that has become a magnet for conspiracy theories of every sort. So recently, the Vatican announced it would open a new investigation of the case. This is coming at the same time that the Italian parliament is opening its own investigation. All of this on the back of a very successful Netflix series called Vatican Girl that generated new publicity around the case. So, of course, we talked about this last week on this show, that the Vatican's chief prosecutor, a guy by the name of Alessandro Didi, recently held an 8-hour meeting with the brother of Emanuela Orlandi, a guy by the name of Pietro Orlandi, who has devoted his life to the search for the truth about his sister. And in the wake of that meeting, Pietro Orlandi went on Italian national television to play a recording of an ex-Roman mobster who alleged that Pope John Paul II had connived in the operation of a pedophile ring inside the Vatican, and that the Cardinal Secretary of State at the time had reached out to the Roman mob basically to kill some of the people who were involved in this ring in order to cover it up, potentially including Emanuela Orlandi. And Pietro Orlandi added that he had been told that John Paul used to go out at night in the company of a couple of Polish monsignors, and as he said, it certainly wasn't to bless houses. Now, that casting of aspersions on the sort of moral reputation, that attempt to steal the halo, in effect, of St. John Paul II, triggered an unusually nasty and feisty war of words. The Vatican's communications apparatus went after Orlandi and his lawyer, saying that they were engaged in basically madness, and that they had also refused to provide information that would be relevant to trying to get to the bottom of all of this, accusing them of basically failing to collaborate. Pope Francis entered the fray last Sunday during his Regina Caeli address, in which he referred to these accusations against John Paul as, quote, offensive and unfounded, and he returned to it 1 week later, this past Sunday, in an interview with the Argentine newspaper La Nación, in which he said that John Paul II was a saint in life and is now formally a saint in death. No one, honestly, can doubt the decency of Pope Wojtyła, end quote. Now, all of that suggests, of course, that there were some hurt feelings and increased tensions on both sides. That is, the Vatican side and also the side of the Orlandis and their attorney. However, in the past week, there were efforts to calm these tensions. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Pope's Secretary of State, in effect, the number 2 figure in the Vatican power structure, said that this investigation, despite the tensions, this investigation is going to go forward. He said that our commitment is to trying to bring clarity, trying to get to the bottom of things. He said we want to go forward with the best of intentions. For his part, Pietro Orlandi tried to walk back what he had said about John Paul II. He went on Italian TV again to say, look, these were not my accusations. These were the words of this Roman mobster. I felt duty-bound to turn that over to the prosecutors. What they make of it is up to them. Nevertheless, there were also signs that both sides haven't forgotten. Cardinal Parolin, for instance, said that the reason the Vatican is going forward was because we owe it to the mother of Emanuela Orlandi, which was taken by many people as, in effect, a shot across the bow at Pietro Orlandi, saying, we may owe your mom, but we don't owe you, so watch your step. Also, Pope Francis's latest comments about John Paul II were taken as a very clear indication from the Vatican side that while we are going to go forward with this investigation, it was also a message to Orlandi and his followers that we are not going to allow you to weaponize this investigation to smear the reputation of John Paul II. On the Orlandi side, they continued to insist that any failure to collaborate was not on their side. You know, Orlandi said on TV, look, I gave my cell phone number to Didi. He can call me 24/7. You know, give me the word, say but the word, and I will be there. So, moral of the story, this investigation is going to go forward, but it does not seem that the bruised feelings that this episode has caused have completely gone away. We'll see what impact that might have as things move forward. All right, second, the trial trundles on. So, the Vatican's trial of the century, this mega trial involving alleged financial crime, mostly centered on a spectacularly failed $400 million real estate deal in London, but also involving allegedly inappropriate transfers of money from the Vatican to a Catholic charity in Sardinia, and also an informant for the Italian secret police who was involved in a Vatican effort to pay a ransom to liberate a Colombian nun who had been kidnapped in Mali. Yes, I know. This is like an opera. You need a libretto to follow all of the characters. But in any event, this trial conducted its 55th and 56th hearings this week. There was a victory for the prosecution. The presiding judge allowed the prosecutor, Alessandro Didi, to expand and revise the charges against several of the defendants. Now, this is an unusual move, right? Because in an American criminal trial, if the DA wanted to change the charges, right, that would mean he would have to withdraw the charges and then refile. The trial would end and a new trial would have to start. That's not how they roll in the Vatican. So on the fly, the prosecutor has been allowed to amend the bill of indictment. There was also a setback for the prosecution, however, because the brother of Cardinal Angelo Becciu had been called to testify and had been unwilling to do it. The prosecutor made a huge deal out of how this was bad and wrong on his part until his lawyer pointed out that under the Vatican's own rules of criminal procedure, you cannot call a close relative of a defendant. You can't compel them to give testimony. So the prosecutor had to kind of shamefacedly admit, oh, well, you know what? Actually, he has the right not to testify. Sorry. So it was kind of a mixed bag. We are still left with a situation where the prosecution is saying that the defendants in this trial tried to pull a fast one. The defense is saying, well, no, actually, this investment in London was potentially a good investment, and had the Vatican not lost its nerve and bungled it, it would have been fine. And it's still not clear which of those competing versions of events ultimately is going to be vindicated. And again, all I can tell you is stay tuned. All right, third, clamp down on the chapel. So we now know that on May 24th, a trial is going to begin against several defendants who were once involved in the administration of the Sistine Chapel, charging illicit use of income from selling tickets to concerts in the Sistine Chapel and also licensing of the recordings of the choir of the Sistine Chapel. Now, the Vatican has not yet revealed exactly who has been charged in this case or exactly what crimes they're accused of. We only have a kind of generic presentation of the facts. Here's what's interesting about it, though. It illustrates a kind of tendency in the Pope Francis era, which is often the punishment precedes the verdict, right? I mean, normally in criminal procedures, you have a trial, you find someone guilty, then you impose sentence. Francis kind of tends to roll the other way around. So in this case, in 2018, rumors emerged that there was some hanky-panky going on in the Sistine Chapel. He authorized an investigation which issued in the indictments that came out this week. Nobody's been found guilty of anything yet, but in the meanwhile, in 2019, he took the Sistine Chapel choir away from the prefecture of the papal household, and he gave it to the papal master of liturgical ceremonies. And also in 2019, he basically fired the Salesian Monsignor, Massimo Palombella, who was running the Sistine Chapel choir, and sent him packing. So, in other words, punishment was imposed years before we've determined whether a crime actually happened. Now, look, I mean, the truth of it is, if you work in the Vatican, you serve at the pleasure of the Pope. He has every right to get rid of people whenever he wants to. It's just, you wonder, why bother with the time and expense of a trial if he's already decided you're guilty? Again, we will see as this plays out. All right, fourth up this week, busting the Blitz. So last August, two radical Italian environmental activists, they belong to a group called Ultima Generazione, or the last generation, bought tickets to go into the Vatican Museum like anybody else. But at a certain point, they broke away from their tour group, climbed up on a famous statue, unfurled a banner saying Ultima Generazione, no carbon, no gas, and refused to leave until the papal gendarme came and hauled them away. Theoretically, under the Vatican's penal code, they could face anywhere between a month and 3 years in jail for this offense and up to a 4,000 euro fine. I'm not quite sure what the point of this trial is, because they actually did selfies of themselves, and they had a friend there recording the video of them climbing up on this statue, so I don't really think that their guilt is in any serious doubt. But what may be interesting about this trial is that they may actually try to call Pope Francis as a witness for the defense. Because, of course, Pope Francis is himself a renowned environmental activist, the first pope to issue an encyclical, Laudato Si', entirely devoted to care of creation, and they may try to argue they were simply acting in the spirit of the Pope's own teaching and the Pope's own advocacy around the environment. And it would be fascinating to see to what extent the prosecution in this case is willing to allow that to play itself out. Again, May 24th looming as a very big deal in terms of crime and punishment in the Vatican. Stay tuned. All right. Of the blues and the grays. So a weird thing happened this week with regard to the Pope's Twitter account, which, has more than 50 million followers. It's one of the biggest deals on Twitter. On Thursday, news made the rounds that Pope Francis had lost that little blue check mark that goes on Twitter accounts to indicate that they are certified, authenticated as being legitimate. This presumably because Elon Musk, the new capo di tutti capi at Twitter, had decided that if you wanted that blue check mark, you had to pay for it. Individuals have to pay, I think it's $8 a month. Organizations have to pay, I think it's $1,000 or something. And then an extra fee for employees and so on, which the Vatican clearly had not done. So temporarily, they lost this blue check mark. Now, we woke up Friday morning to find that instead of a blue check mark, the Pope's account now had a gray one, just like Joe Biden, for instance, just like Vladimir Zelensky and other world leaders. And this gray check mark apparently now signifies that this is the account of a government or a multilateral organization. So instead of the blue certification, they now have a gray certification. Now, what's interesting about this is that when the blue check marks were taken away from people, including Pope Francis, there apparently were other individuals that Musk himself just decided to cover the costs himself, like LeBron James, for instance, or Stephen King, the American novelist, but not Pope Francis. And you sort of wonder, does this signify that Elon Musk was trying to stake a claim to an even greater degree of infallibility than the Pope himself? If that's the case, it wasn't a great week for Elon Musk's claim to infallibility, right? Because not only did you have this unexplained fracas at Twitter, but his space rocket also exploded. And so, I don't know, maybe the lesson here is there's only one guy on the planet who historically has any claim to infallibility, and maybe the rest of us should just slow our roll. All right, sixth up this week, angling for Anglicans. So, the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion ever since the era of Henry VIII has been complicated, right? I mean, the identity of the Anglican Communion is born, right, in the defiance of Roman authority and a kind of disprezzo to the Pope, right? So putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, trying to, pursue some kind of unity and diversity between these two traditions has always been complicated. This week, a couple of new developments on that front. One, in a gesture of respect, it was announced that Pope Francis is going to send fragments of what is believed to be the true cross to be part of the coronation ceremony for King Charles, which is coming up very soon. And that, of course, was seen as a very fraternal and friendly gesture for the Pope to make. And, skeptics would want to know, how do we actually know this is the true cross, right? I mean, the old saying that if all the alleged fragments of the true cross were put together in one place, you'd have an entire forest. I don't know. But in any event, certainly a gesture intended to communicate fraternity, right, and common cause. But at the same time, last week, we also had a group of visiting Anglican clergy, about 50 of them, with their bishop, who had an audience with Pope Francis and who then went and celebrated an Anglican liturgy in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. That is one of the 4 pontifical basilicas in Rome. It was the seat of papal government for centuries during the era of the Papal States. And that celebration was in violation of the Catholic Church's rules for the use of a Catholic church by a non-Catholic community. Basically, what we say is, in general, that shouldn't happen. It can only be permitted if that community doesn't have access to a place of their own to celebrate their services. And of course, there is a perfectly fine Anglican center and church in Rome where this could have happened. So it doesn't appear that there was any ill will on anybody's parts. It was just a breakdown in communication. Now, one thing I will say is that as I was sort of looking at coverage of this incident, I found a podcast, the title of which about this incident was, and I'm quoting here, "Pope Francis allows fake mass by fake bishop at altar of basilica." Now, it isn't often you can actually make 3 separate mistakes in one headline, but this guy went for the hat trick, okay? Let's start with this. Number 1, there is no evidence that Pope Francis even knew this was happening, let alone approved of it. Number 2, this was not a fake mass. This was an Anglican liturgy. They weren't trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. They weren't simulating a Catholic mass. They were conducting their own religious ceremonies. Shouldn't have done it in a Catholic church, but it was not a fake mass. Third, the guy who presided was not a fake bishop. He is actually a perfectly legitimate, duly consecrated and ordained Anglican bishop. It's true the Catholic Church does not recognize the validity of Anglican orders, but he wasn't trying to pass himself off as a Catholic bishop. He was, doing his thing as an Anglican. Like, a fake bishop is a guy who goes to a clerical goods shop in Rome, buys a cassock and a pectoral cross, and then tries to worm his way into some kind of papal event. And if you want to see one of these guys, go to any papal liturgy or papal general audience. It's a rare day that the gendarmes don't find at least one of these guys, trying to pass himself off. That's not the case here, okay? So my point, was this inappropriate and unfortunate? Sure it was. But you know what? There are real scandals in the life of the Catholic Church. We don't need to go manufacturing them. Let's all take a breath and realize this just is not the world's biggest deal. All right, finally this week, Hungering for Hungary. So Pope Francis, this next Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, will be in Hungary. And it seems, from most indications, that he intends to use this visit as a platform from which to address broader European issues, in particular, of course, the war in Ukraine. It is interesting that during his Regina Caeli address this past Sunday, when Pope Francis talked about this trip, he didn't start by saying, "I'm going to Hungary." He started by saying, "I am going to the Centro di Europa, to the center of Europe." Later, of course, he thanked all the Hungarians who were working hard to prepare this visit, but it is clear to him this isn't primarily a visit to a single country, it's a visit to a geographic zone. And it allows him the opportunity to talk about the war in Ukraine, which of course he would see as the premier instance of this third world war that he believes is being fought in piecemeal fashion all around the globe. Ironically, one of the things that will be interesting about this trip is that even though Pope Francis and Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary are at odds on multiple issues, from migrants and refugees to the environment to any number of other things, when it comes to their diagnosis of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, they are actually fairly close. Both would be clearly sympathetic to the suffering of the Ukrainians, but both would also favor a negotiated settlement. Both would feel that Russia may have legitimate security interests at stake in this conflict that need to be attended to. So it may be that we may see a kind of odd couple dynamic emerge here, where Pope Francis and Orban, despite their differences in many other areas, can maybe do some business on this front. In any event, I bring you tidings of great joy. And those tidings are that by far the best, most scintillating and insightful coverage of this trip is going to be on the Crux site, because my wife Elise Ann Allen will be on the papal plane, accompanying Pope Francis on this trip. And as we like to say, she will have this story covered like saran wrap. So be checking the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Again, cruxnow.com for full and breaking coverage of Pope Francis in Hungary. Can I just say, whew, wow, that was a lot to cover in one episode. Thank you for bearing with us. As ever, you can find full coverage of all these stories and much, much more on the Crux site. Again, that is cruxnow.com. I encourage you, while you were on the site, if you were so inclined and you have the means, please make a small financial donation to Crux. We have a handy-dandy box there where you can do it. We love bringing you the news. We love bringing it to you in written fashion on the site. We love bringing it to you through this weekly video. I mean, folks, I have a blast doing this. I look forward to this all week. But the truth of it is, it ain't cheap. You know, we need help keeping the lights on and keeping the show running. So if you can help us out, we would be extraordinarily grateful. It doesn't have to be much. You know, maybe just what you would spend on streaming a movie this week or going out to eat, whatever. But whatever you can do, we would be extraordinarily grateful. We will be here next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. We will break down Pope Francis in Hungary and everything else that will have happened between now and then. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week, and we will talk to you again very soon.